Joining us now on Empty the Bench, he covers MLB for ESPN.com, a regular contributor to ESPN 1000 in Chicago, Jesse Rogers. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Of course. Good to be with you guys.
So let's get right into it. A lot of drama going on in MLB, a lot of the negotiations. The three of us here are missing baseball, so let's just deal with the elephant in the room. Do you think that the league and the MLBPA are going to come to an agreement anytime soon?
Well, an agreement is a loaded word. They're probably going to play baseball, but they may not agree on the terms. And that's upsetting because it really does need to be a partnership in this thing. You see what the NBA and the NHL have done moving forward. I'm sure the NFL have to make concessions with health protocols and things. You in something like this, in a crisis moment, you need both sides to be on the same page, and they certainly are not. I still think it's more likely they'll play than less likely, but it'll be under some really tough circumstances, I think, and some acrimony that's going to carry over. But, for the average fan, all they want to see is baseball. I don't think they care how the sausage is made. So I still think they'll play, but if it's a 50-game season, I kind of feel like it's a glorified spring training. But if they get an expanded playoff, that could be interesting. That could be fun. I don't think the World Series champion is going to be – in some ways it's going to have an asterisk no matter what. The whole deal about the World Series champion has been 162 games, and before that, 145 or whatever. The marathon of the season is the reason the championship is so sought after. But you take what you can get, so they'll probably play, but it may not be under ideal conditions.
So looking at the stigma or the situation, however you want to put it, with the owners, why are the owners using the media to paint the players as the ones at fault in this negotiation?
Well, a couple reasons. One thing is it seems like they're leaking a lot, right? And I think that's because they think that union leadership isn't necessarily telling its members everything they need to know. So I think they're leaking things to us in the media in order to communicate to players directly. That's usually why leaks occur in negotiations like this. So we can get things out, one, for public opinion, win the court of public opinion, and also to get around leadership and talk directly to the people that are not doing the negotiating. Now, in this case, there's only 30 owners, so there's not a lot of differing opinions there, but there's 1,200 players at different parts of their career, beginning, middle, and end, different amounts of money being made by those guys from $500,000 all the way up to $35 million. So the owners are using some classical negotiating tactics, getting around union leadership and going right to the players and trying to appeal to them and their emotions. And that's the key thing here. If you're part of the union, you have to take emotion out of it and you have to stay unified, and that's what the players are trying to do.
So, Jesse, working under the assumption that a season is going to be played, are there any contingency plans you know of in place should one or more players test positive for COVID-19?
No, that's the million-dollar question. Their goal is, if someone tests positive, to isolate them, but baseball continues. The problem, and I've talked to many officials about this, is if one guy gets through and infects the whole locker room, then they're in trouble, and they don't really have an answer for that. So the goal is to test as much as possible and to isolate immediately if someone tests positive, and someone's bound to test positive. And so they're crossing their fingers. I think all the leagues are. You can't infect the whole locker room. If you do, you've got to shut down the team, and that means shutting down other teams possibly. There's a domino effect. So if they can isolate a single player, that's the goal there, but there's no guarantees.
So going to the international problems, we're seeing this with all the other sports, and you have the Blue Jays who are in Canada. We had the games in Puerto Rico. I think the Mets and the Marlins were supposed to play at the beginning of the season in Puerto Rico. How do we deal with the travel restrictions for international games if we're having problems with travel right now?
Well, I think they'll be lifted for the play. We already see that foreign-born players are allowed back in the country to play in any sport. We're only talking about one city, Toronto, right? I think they'll work something out, unless there's an outbreak in Toronto or an outbreak in the States where the Canadian government doesn't want Canadians going, whatever. I think they will it sounds like government officials, especially in the United States, are bending over backwards for sports to return. They're not pushing back on, you could imagine a scenario where, let's say, there wasn't enough testing, or they couldn't, their first responders were being used, stretched thin, and governments would be pushing back on sports, but they're not. They're bending over backwards. I haven't studied the Canadian aspect of it so much, but I think, for that one team, they will make things happen. And going back to, let's say, first responders, police and firemen and stuff. Look, there's no, at least I'm in Chicago and I know New York's the same. There's no outdoor festivals. There's no music festivals. There's no concerts. There's nothing. So time that they were going to be used for other things, they're not being used for events. So I think you can handle an event at Wrigley Field or Sox Park. Same thing in New York, I think. So I think the governments are more than willing to help out.
So now, Jesse, since the UFC's return about a month ago, it had been dealing with all the COVID testing with its athletes, the purchasing of tests. One of their events, the very first one, 249, still went on despite a fighter testing positive, and they just recently had a false positive come in. Will the MLB be forced to purchase these tests, and will it be a bad look compared to the negative feelings surrounding MLB right now?
No, I don't think it'd be a bad look. As long as there's enough testing elsewhere, and they say that there will be, they won't take tests away from anyone else. It's going to cost clubs, I don't know, anywhere between $5 and $10 million to test for the season. So they have their own lab in Utah. Again, if they're guaranteeing they're not taking resources from everyday people, I think it's not going to be necessarily a bad look. I don't feel like maybe it's an issue, but we don't hear a lot of places complaining about testing. Maybe they should be, because this virus is still out there. But I feel like, I don't know, at least publicly, it seems like they've tackled the testing issue. That could change if there's major outbreaks and hotspots. But right now, it seems like everybody's in line. I mean, and the NBA and the NHL have to test as well, so baseball will be no different in that respect.
So, Jesse, I assume you heard about the email between the union heads that Joel Sherman had tweeted about a couple of weeks ago, that they were willing to renegotiate about games that have empty stands, basically.
Right.
Do you believe that that's going to be an area of pushback between the players, or do you think they're all in agreement on empty stands being the norm?
No, I mean, they're okay with the empty stands. They're just not okay with their salary being reduced anymore. Now, you're talking about the email exchange that came out as a result of the late March agreement, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the smoking gun.
Yeah, so I don't think I think it's a smoking gun, but in a different way, if you want to follow my logic here. So I've seen the agreement, okay? The agreement is ambiguous when it comes to discussing further salary reductions when it comes to playing without fans. And the smoking gun for that ambiguousness of that deal is that email exchange. In other words, if that was a clear agreement, the union would not have even needed to send an email saying, wait a minute, are we supposed to talk about this again later? I just need to clarify. Now, granted, the union said, yes, we're talking about this later, but you wouldn't need that. And I've seen the agreement, and I've said this on 1,000 radio shows in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks. That agreement should have had 5 pages of how much players will be paid if there are fans in the stands, and 5 pages on how much players will be paid without fans in the stands. It had 6 words, and it wasn't even under compensation. It was under a different section, and it said we'll have to discuss the economic feasibility of playing without fans. And so players didn't even take that in regards to their salaries. Now, maybe some agents did, and there's some confusion. But again, that email exchange shows how ambiguous that agreement sounded and was written. That's on both sides. These are seasoned negotiators and lawyers that wrote that agreement up. And I haven't talked to one person in one official in baseball, one agent, or anyone that's seen that agreement that doesn't agree with me. It was poorly written, and that smoking gun is that email exchange.
Talking to Jesse Rogers, who covers Major League Baseball for ESPN and also the Cubs on ESPN 1000. Follow him at Jesse Rogers ESPN. Now, I want to go a little bit outside the box. I know a lot of people are not talking about Commissioner Manfred, but what do you think is going on in his head during the negotiations between the MLBPA and the owners? And do you find it a little odd that he's trying to restrict the season? We're hearing that he might do a 50-game season if they can't come to negotiate. What do you think is in his mind right now?
Yeah, it's a little upside down where less games is better for teams. They claim that the more games they play, the more they lose. That might be true because I know how these owners are, and they think of money first. And if more games meant more money, they'd probably play. But look, Manfred's doing their bidding, and they are not going to kowtow to the players. They are taking their losses. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of us that have opinions on this, and obviously all the players say, tough luck. You bought the team. You've got to deal with the good times and the bad times. And you can't pass off your losses on your employees who are contracted part of a union. They would have to agree to it. And the players who would agree to giving back their salary without proof, by the way, about the losses. But again, the players don't even care about the losses because for 19 straight years, revenues have gone up, and the players don't always see those things. So Manfred is just – he wants a win for the owners. And a win is I guess, losing a little bit less than they would if they just kowtowed to the players. There's no doubt they're going to lose, but that's too bad. These are billionaire owners. They've got the money. And so Manfred's just trying to strike the best possible deal. And I guess playing less is the best possible deal.
Now, speaking of money and speaking of agencies, Scott Boras, can you explain his involvement in this situation? And is he really just doing this for the money, or are there other motives behind him trying to get involved?
I don't know any other motives for an agent other than money. I mean, that's what they're in the business for. Yeah, I mean, he's just a leading voice. At least he thinks he is. Because of the caliber of players he has and the amount of money those guys make. Some people, I hear differing opinions on how much of a voice he has. I mean, it's a big voice, but is it any bigger than any other agents? I don't know, but he certainly talks publicly more than other agents. So he's just another cog in this whole thing. I don't think the whole agreement is decided upon, Scott Boras's agreement or disagreement with it, but he certainly has a voice within the union, no doubt.
So, Jesse, we know that you are in the trenches every day with teams. You're not, and not just the Cubs, pretty much just every NL team and even AL teams. I mean, you know what players think, how they work. So, in your best estimation, drawing on your experience as a beat reporter, do you think that this plan is feasible at all, or is it just a train wreck waiting to happen?
Well, are you talking about just executing the games day to day, that kind of stuff?
Day-to-day stuff.
It's a good question because these players are creatures of habit, and their routines are already way off. I know there are players upset that they're not going to have the right amount of lead time even to get to spring training, because let's say there's an agreement on Monday. They're going to want to start spring training like that, and players aren't going to be necessarily ready, especially pitchers. And they're going to have shortened spring trainings. And then you get into the season, and they may not be able to use all the equipment, in the locker rooms and the weight rooms and stuff, and the travel is going to be different. Yeah, it's going to be difficult. Here's the thing. There's going to be injuries. And these guys, I think, are going to err on the side of caution. A 50-game season guy in week 2 pulls his hamstring, you may not see him. You may not see him the rest of the year. It's going to be weird. Shoulder soreness, going to shut down like that. They're not going to risk 2021 and beyond to make 25% of their salary. And by the way, if you get hurt and you're out, you still get your salary. So I think that's the under-talked about thing here. Injuries are going to play a huge, huge part. And I don't think star players are going to push it at all. I could see, especially if the players return in an unhappy situation, I could see guys, the moment they have a ding or a dent, sitting out because they get paid, and they're just not going to risk it for what? To play 40 games? It's a watered down season and World Series title. So you're asking me about players? That's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about injuries and the risk versus reward for them.
All right, final question, Jesse, and this has to do with the consequences between the league and the union. We've also heard guys like Mike Trout, who I think has a baby coming on the way, and he's not sure if he really wants to play. Does he really want to put himself at risk? What are the major consequences, especially if the star players don't want to come back and play? Do you really? I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're a betting man, do you think there's really going to be a MLB season, and is it worth it?
I don't think it's necessarily worth it at 40 to 50 games. I don't. It's just that's a glorified spring training, as I said. So I think it has to be half a season. And I'm a guy that thinks it should be about 100 games every year. But 80 to 100 is a good amount. I don't see how you could spend 4 weeks of spring training to play 6 weeks of baseball before the postseason. So I don't necessarily think it's worth it at 40 to 50 games. As far as star players and stuff, look, I don't think they'll agree to return en masse if 95% or more or 98% of the stars don't return. Like, they're not going to make this agreement and whether it's agreement or not, they're not going to say, okay, we'll come back, but then 15 stars don't. I just don't see that. Could one or two? Maybe, especially if they're only getting 25% of their salary. But again, I think they will make an agreement. The very vast majority of guys will either say we're coming back or we're not. Again, there could be a couple stragglers either way, but I don't think it's going to be half and half, and the players are going to show this divide publicly. That's the last thing they want. But there's always a chance a few players, star players or not, could refuse to play.
That is Jesse Rogers. He covers Major League Baseball for ESPN.com, also here on Monday ESPN 1000 in Chicago, and along with Jeff Passan has been working really hard on covering the negotiations between the MLBPA and the owners, and hopefully we get some baseball soon, but I'm not too sure. But Jesse, thanks for joining us.
You got it, guys. Call anytime.